there's a fundamental truth about 14,000 tons of moving steel. It does not care about your quarterly projections. Iron has no ego, no ambition, and no respect for a manager's timeline. When a machine that size tries to tell you it is dying, you listen. If you don't, the machine doesn't just break. It takes its revenge on whoever happens to be standing underneath it. For the record, Inspector, I need you to understand what BWE7 actually is. The company prospectus calls it a bucket wheel excavator. The executives in the air-conditioned offices call it the asset. But when you are sitting in the primary control cabin, suspended 120 feet above the pit floor, you realize it is something closer to a man-made leviathan. It spans over 700 feet from the counterweight boom to the tip of the digging wheel. It moves on crawler tracks that are taller than a two-story house, and the wheel itself, it is 50 feet in diameter, fitted with 18 massive steel buckets that chew through the earth, tearing away thousands of tons of overburden an hour. When BWE7 is running at full capacity, the noise isn't something you just hear. It is something you endure. The deep, guttural thrum of the diesel generators and the high-pitched whine of the electric motors sink into your bones. I was the only operator on site holding a master's certification for a Class A excavator. I've spent 22 years in the seats of these monsters. Over time, you stop driving the machine and start wearing it. You feel the tension in the cables through the control yokes. You know the exact pitch the slew motors should make when swinging a full load of wet clay versus dry shale. It is a rhythm, a heartbeat of grease, electricity, and iron. On the ground, directly beneath the shadow of the main boom, was Davis. He was the ground crew foreman, a man I'd known for a decade. Davis had the toughest job on the site, managing the spotters, the cable handlers, and the maintenance runners who scuttled around the tracks like ants at the feet of a giant. We communicated mostly through brief radio clicks and a mutual understanding built on years of shared dust. He trusted me not to drop a house-sized chunk of limestone on his head, and I trusted him to keep my path clear. Everything operated on a delicate balance of massive forces. The entire upper superstructure of the machine, thousands of tons of boom, wheel, and counterweight rested on a single massive component, the main slew bearing. It is the literal pivot point of the machine's universe, a ring of steel and rollers as wide as a tennis court, constantly grinding under unimaginable pressure. You asked me when I knew something was wrong. You assumed there was an alarm, a flashing red light on my console, or a sudden catastrophic snap. That is not how heavy machinery fails, Inspector. It doesn't scream. First, it whispers. And on the morning of October 14th, BWE7 started whispering to me. It happened just after 11 in the morning. The sky was the color of bruised slate, and the air in the cab tasted faintly of ozone and hydraulic fluid. I was executing a standard horizontal terrace cut, sweeping the massive wheel from left to right across the face of the coal seam. I had my left hand on the slew joystick, controlling the lateral swing. The rhythm was steady. Bite, lift, drop to the conveyor. Swing, bite, lift, drop, swing. Then, right at the apex of the swing, I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration. A micro stutter that traveled up through the floorboards, past my heavy work boots, and settled in my jaw. It lasted less than a second, a sharp, jagged hesitation in the otherwise smooth rotation of the superstructure. I immediately neutralized the controls. The massive wheel slowed, the buckets hovering just inches from the dirt wall. Baker to ground. Davis, you copy? I keyed the mic, my eyes scanning the dozens of digital readouts and analog pressure gauges surrounding me. Static hissed before Davis's gruff voice came through. Copy, Andrew. Everything all right up there? You stopped mid-chew. I felt a shudder in the swing. Main slew bearing, maybe a fouled roller. Did you hear anything down there? Negative, Andrew. It's deafening down here as usual. You want me to send a greaser up the scaffolding to take a look? I stared at my diagnostics panel. The telemetry looked normal. Slew motor amperage was within acceptable parameters. Bearing temperature read green. A computer would say the machine was in perfect health, but a computer doesn't sit in the chair. A computer doesn't feel the vibration that throws off a 22-year rhythm. Hold your guys back, Davis. Keep them out from under the boom, I instructed. I'm gonna run a dry swing. Watch the track housing. I gently engaged the slew joystick, swinging the massive upper chassis to the right without digging. For 20 degrees of rotation, it was smooth. Then thrum catch. There it was again. A harsh, grinding vibration that vibrated through the steel deck. It was worse this time. The bearing wasn't just groaning, it was catching. Under the weight of a full load, the friction would be astronomical. Something inside the main bearing housing was failing. A roller had shattered, or the race itself was beginning to warp. I hit the primary hydraulic brake, locking the superstructure in place. I reached for the radio, switching off the local ground channel and tuning it to the site management frequency. My stomach tightened. I knew exactly who was sitting in the site office, and I knew exactly how this conversation was going to go. BWE-7 to base. Carter, you on the channel? It took a long 30 seconds before Carter Campbell responded. When he did, his voice was crisp, impatient, and lacking any of the background noise that blanketed the rest of the site. Campbell was the site superintendent. He was 42, possessed a shiny degree in logistics, and had never operated a piece of machinery larger than a golf cart. His entire world was defined by the spreadsheets glowing on his dual monitors. Go ahead, Baker. We're showing a drop in conveyor volume on our end. Why are you stationary? I've got a vibration in the main slew bearing, Carter, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. It's catching on the right-hand traverse. I need to lock out the machine and get a maintenance crew up here to inspect the raceway. There was a heavy sigh over the radio. Baker, we just had the scheduled lube cycle on that bearing last week. The diagnostics board here is showing all green. Are there any warning lights on your end? No warning lights. No warning lights, but I can feel it in the deck. It's a hard shudder, and it's worsening. If that bearing seizes while under load. If it seizes, the shear pins will snap and the motors will trip. Campbell interrupted smoothly, reciting the manual. We are 30,000 tons behind our quarterly projection, Andrew. Corporate is breathing down my neck. I need that wheel turning. With respect, Carter, the shear pins only protect the motors. They don't protect the structural integrity of the mast. If a bearing this size seizes while swinging 14,000 tons of momentum, the torque has nowhere to go but into the frame. It will tear the machine apart. I am not shutting down a $50 million asset for an unscheduled multi-day maintenance inspection because you felt a shiver in your boots, Baker. Operators don't stop for vibration. You stop for an alarm. You stop for a failure. You push through. I gripped to the edge of my console, my knuckles turning white. Down below, I could see Davis and his crew looking up at the stationary machine, waiting for orders. They looked incredibly small against the massive steel tracks. I am the only certified Class A operator on this site, Carter. My license, my call. The machine is unsafe. I am initiating a lockout. Do not touch that lockout tag, Baker. Campbell's voice dropped, losing its corporate polish and taking on a cold, hard edge. You are paid to move dirt. If you refuse to operate that machine, I will find someone who will. Now, are you going to swing that wheel? Or are we having a different kind of conversation? He was bluffing. He had to be. You don't put a novice in the seat of BWE-7. It was an unwritten rule, a matter of fundamental industrial survival. But as I listened to the hiss of the radio static, I realized Carter Campbell didn't care about survival. He only cared about the spreadsheet. I'm not moving it, Carter. And you can't force me to put those men down there in danger. Watch me, Campbell snapped. Stay in your cab. I'm coming out there. The silence in the cab was heavier than the noise had been. I didn't wait for Carter Campbell to make the long drive from the site office and climb the 120 feet of grating to my cabin. As soon as I took my hand off the radio, I reached up to the overhead panel and engaged the emergency lockout protocol. I flipped the heavy plastic covers, depressed the 3 primary breaker switches, and pulled the physical master key from the ignition cylinder. The deep vibrating hum of the BWE-7 slowly spun down. The massive electrical relays clacked open, severing power to the slew motors, the track drives, and the bucket wheel itself. I slid a red lockout tag-out hasp through the master breaker, snapped my personal brass padlock shut, and pocketed the key. By law, and by every safety manual ever printed, nobody could power up that machine until the person who placed that lock removed it. It was the ultimate boundary line in heavy industry. It meant a man's life or the machine's safety was at imminent risk. 20 minutes later, the heavy steel door of my cab violently swung open. The wind howled into the confined space, bringing with it the smell of diesel and dust, followed immediately by Campbell. He was out of breath from the climb, his pristine white hard hat a stark contrast to the grease-stained environment of my cabin. "Unlock it," Campbell demanded, not even bothering to catch his breath. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger at the main console. Unlock that board right now, Baker. I stayed in my seat, turning slowly to face him. The main slew bearing is compromised, Carter. If I apply digging torque to that wheel, the rotational friction is going to overcome the structural limits of the bearing race. It's going to seize. The sensors are green, Campbell yelled, stepping closer, invading the tight space of the cab. Maintenance signed off on it. Corporate signed off on it. You are the only one holding up production, and it is costing us $32,000 an hour. Now take that lock off. Sensors only read what they are programmed to read. They measure temperature and electrical draw. They don't measure a mechanical stutter until the metal is already tearing, I explained, keeping my voice dangerously calm. If it seizes while we're swinging, the inertia of 14,000 tons of steel will rip the upper chassis right off the track housing. Do you understand what that means? The boom will collapse. It will crush whoever's underneath it. Campbell's face flushed a deep, furious red. What I understand is that you are an operator. Your job is to pull levers. My job is to manage the site. I am telling you, as the site superintendent, that the machine is operational. I am the master certified operator of this excavator, I replied, standing up to meet his eyes. My signature is on the daily safety log. I don't care about your spreadsheets or your quarterly bonus, Carter. I care about the men on the ground. I am giving you an ultimatum. You call in the heavy maintenance crew to inspect that bearing or this machine stays locked out. Campbell stared at me, his jaw set. The air between us was electric with hostility. He wasn't looking at a man trying to save lives. He was looking at an obstacle to his promotion. No, Campbell said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. You don't issue ultimatums here. You are fired, Andrew. Effective immediately. Hand over the padlock key. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. The cold finality in his voice told me that the point of no return had been crossed. You can't force me to hand over a personal lockout key, Carter. It's against federal regulations, I said quietly. Then I'll have security bring up the bolt cutters, Campbell countered, pulling his site radio from his belt. Base, this is Campbell. Send Mitch up to the primary cab of BWE 7 and tell him to bring the master maintenance keys. We have a faulty lockout. Mitch. My stomach plummeted. Mitch was 30 years old, fresh out of the simulator academy, and had exactly 3 months of seat time on a Class C loader. He had never operated anything larger than a dump truck, let alone a continuous bucket wheel excavator. Mitch isn't rated for this machine, I warned him. He doesn't know the rhythms. He won't feel the vibration until it's too late. Mitch follows orders, Campbell shot back. While Campbell turned his back to monitor his radio, I smoothly slid my hand beneath the primary console. Every BWE has an encrypted telematics black box that records every keystroke, every sensor readout, and every radio transmission. I pulled a thumb-sized diagnostic drive from my vest, slotted it into the maintenance port, and initiated a silent download. If they were going to fire me for a safety shutdown, I was going to need proof of what I felt and what I said. The progress bar on my small secondary screen filled just as heavy footsteps clanged on the metal stairs outside. Mitch stepped into the cab. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between me and Campbell. You wanted me, mister. Campbell? Mitch asked, clutching his lunch cooler. Baker is no longer an employee of this company, Campbell announced. Take the seat, Mitch. I'm having maintenance cut his lock. I want this wheel turning in 10 minutes. I pulled my diagnostic drive from the port, concealing it in my palm before slipping it into my pocket. I grabbed my thermos and my battered jacket, moving toward the door. As I passed Mitch, I stopped and looked the young man dead in the eye. Mitch, listen to me, I said, my voice low and urgent. The main slew bearing is catching on the right side lateral traverse. If you try to push through it, the bearing will seize. Do not swing this machine. Mitch swallowed hard, looking toward Campbell for guidance. Ignore Mitch, Campbell sneered. He's just disgruntled because he couldn't handle the quota. The board is green. I shook my head, feeling a profound, sinking dread. It's your funeral, kid. Just pray you don't take anyone else with you. The walk down the scaffolding was the longest descent of my life. Every clang of my boots against the metal grating felt like a death toll. I was leaving my machine. I was leaving the Leviathan in the hands of a man who only saw it as a stepping stone, and a kid who didn't know enough to be terrified. When I reached the ground level, the sheer scale of the BWE loomed over me. The shadow of the massive digging arm stretched across the limestone floor, casting a dark canopy over the ground crew staging area. Davis was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Two site security guards were standing a few yards behind him, waiting to escort me off the property. Davis took one look at my face, and his expression fell. "Andrew, what the heck is going on? Radio chatter says Campbell just relieved you." "He fired me, Davis," I said, stepping close to my old friend. I kept my voice low so the guards couldn't hear. "He's putting Mitch in the seat." Davis blanched. "Mitch, the kid can barely drive a pickup without stalling it." "Why would he do that?" "Because I locked out the machine. The main bearing is failing, Davis. It's shuddering bad. I told Campbell it needs a full inspection, and he told me to get off the property. They're cutting my lock right now." Davis looked up at the towering superstructure. His face tightened with conflict. He had 20 men under his command, men with mortgages and families who relied on the hourly wage that only flowed when the dirt was moving. "The sensors," Davis started, looking for a sliver of hope. "The sensors are blind to this," I interrupted firmly. "Listen to me, Davis. I am telling you, as the man who has run this machine for a decade, it is going to break. When Mitch tries to force that lateral swing under load, it will seize. You need to pull your men back. Clear the shadow of the boom. If I pull my men back without authorization, Campbell will fire me too, Andrew. He'll fire the whole crew. If you don't pull them back, you're going to be putting them in body bags," I pleaded, grabbing his arm. "At least move the cable handlers out of the direct drop zone, please, Davis." "Hey, let's go, Baker!" one of the security guards barked, stepping forward and gesturing toward the waiting truck. "You're trespassing." I let go of Davis's arm. The foreman looked devastated, trapped between his livelihood and his life. "Watch the track housing, Davis," I said as the guards fell in beside me. "If you hear the metal scream, you run." They placed me in the back of the security pickup. As the truck drove away, kicking up a trail of white dust, I looked back through the rear window. The BWE stood silent against the gray sky, a sleeping giant. But I knew the silence wouldn't last. The security truck dropped me at the outer perimeter gate, 2 miles down a winding access road from the active pit. The guard, a young guy named Torres who usually waved me through with a smile, wouldn't meet my eyes as he demanded my site badge and radio. I handed them over without a word. My pockets were heavy with the weight of my personal tools, but it was the small plastic diagnostic drive in my chest pocket that felt like it was burning a hole through my shirt. "Sorry, Mr. Baker," Torres mumbled, turning back to his climate-controlled booth. "Superintendent's orders. You're off the property." I didn't call my wife to come pick me up. I didn't start the long walk down the highway toward town. I simply crossed the white painted line that marked the company boundary, leaned against the heavy chain-link fencing, and stared out across the vast, scarred landscape of the mine. From here, BWE 7 looked less like a monster and more like a complicated steel skeleton on the horizon. The air was unnervingly still. I checked my watch. It had been 35 minutes since I placed the padlock. By now, maintenance would have snapped the hasp with bolt cutters. Campbell would be standing behind Mitch's chair, breathing down his neck, demanding he spool up the generators. I couldn't see the ground crew from this distance, but I knew exactly where they were. They were right where the manual told them to be, clustered near the crawler tracks, managing the high-voltage trailing cables and prepping the secondary conveyor belts. Right in the kill zone. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the cold metal of the fence. I tried to convince myself that I was wrong. Maybe it was just a localized pocket of hard shale that had caused the vibration. Maybe the bearing would hold for another month. Maybe Campbell was right, and I was just an aging operator jumping at shadows. But my hands knew better. The muscle memory in my forearms, honed over 20 years of feeling that machine move, told me the truth. It was a mechanical certainty. Then, rolling across the miles of open air, I heard it. It started as a low, throaty rumble, followed by the high-pitched whine of the massive electrical turbines engaging. The sound carried easily over the open pit. They were powering it up. I gripped the chain-link fence, my fingers curling through the diamond gaps. "Don't do it, kid," I whispered to the empty air. "Just let it idle." 10 seconds later, the low rumble deepened. They were engaging the bucket wheel. Even from 2 miles away, the sequence of events was terrifyingly clear. I watched the silhouette of the massive machine. The 50-foot digging wheel began to spin, blurring against the gray sky. I watched the massive upper superstructure begin to slowly pan to the right, sweeping the spinning wheel toward the coal seam. Mitch was initiating the lateral traverse. He was doing exactly what I had warned him not to do. In my mind, I was back in the cab. I could feel the sequence perfectly. Swing right. Engage the rock face. Let the buckets bite. Now, the weight transfers. 14,000 tons of resistance meets the lateral push of the slew motors. Everything funnels down to that one central pivot point, the main bearing. Through the quiet air, a sound erupted that I will never forget. It was not a mechanical hum or an engine roar. It was a scream. It was the agonizing, high-pitched shriek of thick steel tearing under impossible friction. It sounded like a freight train locking its brakes, magnified 100 times. The massive slew bearing, starved of structural integrity and forced to rotate under a full digging load, had seized completely solid. But the massive electrical slew motors didn't know that. They kept pushing. The buckets were dug deep into the earth, anchoring the front of the machine, while the motors tried to twist the back. The torque had to go somewhere. From my vantage point, the BWE-7 seemed to shudder violently. The long horizontal boom holding the digging wheel jerked. Bang! The sound of the structural shear pins snapping echoed across the valley like a volley of cannon fire. But the pins weren't enough to absorb the catastrophic momentum. With a sickening groan of twisting metal, the entire upper superstructure of the machine torqued off its axis. The mast, built to withstand incredible vertical weight but entirely vulnerable to massive rotational shearing, buckled. I watched in absolute horror as the front half of the machine, the boom, and the 50-foot bucket wheels simply tore away from the main chassis. It fell. Thousands of tons of steel, dirt, and electrical cabling plummeted 100 feet to the pit floor. The impact sent a massive shock wave of dust and pulverized rock blooming into the air, obscuring the base of the machine. The earth trembled beneath my feet, reaching me seconds after the visual impact. The silence that followed was total, heavy, and profound. The low hum of the generators was gone, replaced by the hissing of severed hydraulic lines. And then, faintly, floating across the desolate landscape, came the sound of the site-wide emergency sirens. I didn't think. I just ran. I pushed off the fence and sprinted back toward the security booth. Torres was standing outside, pale and wide-eyed, staring at the rising plume of dust on the horizon. His radio was screaming with frantic, overlapping voices. "Medical! Get medical to Sector 4! The boom collapsed!" "Oh my God, the whole arm is down!" "Let me in, Torres," I demanded, grabbing his shoulder. "I can't, Baker. You're off the... People are dead down there." I roared, my voice cracking. "I know that machine. I know where the hazard zones are. Open the gate." Torres didn't argue this time. He hit the buzzer and I sprinted through, commandeering an idle maintenance cart. I drove recklessly down the haul roads, weaving between massive dump trucks that had slammed on their brakes at the sound of the collapse. When I reached the staging area, the scale of the disaster was paralyzing. The massive digging arm, previously suspended high in the air, now lay crumpled across the pit floor like a broken spine. The 50-foot bucket wheel was half buried in the earth. The massive steel teeth twisted and shattered. Thick black smoke was billowing from the severed hydraulic reservoirs on the main chassis above, and waterfalls of bright green fluid were raining down over the wreckage. But it was the chaos on the ground that made my chest tighten. The drop zone, the exact area I had begged Davis to clear, was buried under tons of steel and displaced earth. Men covered in gray dust were scrambling over the wreckage, frantically pulling at tangled high-voltage cables and jagged pieces of grating. "Davis!" I yelled, abandoning the cart and running toward the debris field. "Davis!" I found him near the edge of the collapse. He was sitting on a crushed toolbox, his high-vis vest stained dark with hydraulic fluid and blood. He was holding his left arm against his chest. It bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. His face was a mask of shock, pale beneath a thick layer of limestone dust. I dropped to my knees beside him. "Davis, look at me. Who is under there?" He blinked, slowly focusing on my face. "Andrew? You were right. You were right." It screamed, and then it just fell. "Who was under the boom, Davis?" I repeated, shaking his good shoulder gently. He swallowed hard. I tried to pull them back after you left. I moved the cable guys, but Henderson and Miller, they were adjusting the secondary belt. They didn't have time to run." My stomach turned to ice. Henderson had a newborn at home. Miller was 22, saving up for welding school. "Medical is coming. I told him, my voice hollow. I looked up past the wreckage, up the towering height of the surviving superstructure, toward the primary cab. The windows were shattered from the sheer force of the torsion snap. I knew Mitch was up there, likely battered and terrified, but my fury wasn't directed at the kid. He was just a pawn. I scanned the chaotic staging area until I found the pristine white hard hat. Carter Campbell was standing 50 yards back, flanked by security, staring at the ruin of his $50 million asset. He looked utterly terrified. Our eyes met across the dust-filled air. He knew what he had done, and he knew that I knew. The next 72 hours were a blur of flashing lights, federal investigators, and grim news. It took the heavy rescue teams 14 hours to cut through the mangled steel of the boom. They found Henderson and Miller. The company issued a sterile press release about a tragic, unforeseen structural anomaly and promised a full investigation. I sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The local news was playing on mute in the corner, showing aerial footage of the ruined BWE-7. Davis was in the hospital, recovering from a compound fracture and internal bruising. Mitch had been pulled from the cab with a severe concussion and shattered ribs. Then the phone rang. It wasn't the company. It was a lawyer from the regional OSHA office asking me to come in for an emergency deposition. When I arrived at the sterile fluorescent-lit federal building downtown, I expected to give my statement and walk out. Instead, I walked into an ambush. Sitting across the long conference table were two federal investigators, a stenographer, and three men in sharp suits. I recognized the lead suit immediately, Marcus Sterling, the mining corporation's senior legal counsel. Beside him sat Carter Campbell. Campbell looked awful pale, sweating, and avoiding my gaze, but he was clearly following Sterling's lead. "Mr. Baker, please take a seat," the lead investigator, a weary-looking woman named Harris, instructed. "We are trying to piece together the events leading to the catastrophic failure of BWE-7. The company has presented a rather disturbing narrative regarding your actions on the day of the incident." "My actions?" I asked, sitting down heavily. Marcus Sterling leaned forward, his hands clasped smoothly on the table. "Mr. Baker, the company logs indicate that you were terminated for insubordination and threatening behavior approximately 40 minutes before the collapse. I was fired for locking out an unsafe machine," I corrected coldly. "That is not what the internal telemetry shows, Mr. Baker," Sterling countered, his voice slick. "According to the system diagnostics extracted from the base servers, the machine was operating within safe parameters. Superintendent Campbell has testified, under oath, that you became belligerent when asked to increase production speed. He states that you initiated a spiteful, unauthorized lockout, and when relieved of duty, you tampered with the primary console before leaving the cab." The room went dead silent. I stared at Sterling, then slowly shifted my gaze to Campbell. The coward was actually trying to pin the deaths of two men on me. He was suggesting I sabotaged the machine. "You're claiming I caused the failure?" I asked, the sheer audacity of the lie temporarily stealing my breath. "We are suggesting," Sterling said carefully, "that an angry, disgruntled employee, possessing intricate knowledge of the machine's systems, intentionally engaged the emergency slew brakes while the replacement operator was initiating a lateral traverse, causing the catastrophic shear. That is a physical impossibility without the master key, which Campbell's maintenance team cut." I shot back, turning to Investigator Harris. "He ordered a novice operator to swing the machine under load when the main bearing was actively failing. I warned him. I warned the replacement. I warned the ground foreman." "Unfortunately, Mr. Baker," Harris sighed, looking at her notes. "Mr. Baker," Harris sighed, looking at her notes. "Mr. Baker." Campbell denies any such warning took place. "The replacement operator, Mitch, states he was only told you were fired for insubordination, and the internal black box on the BWE-7 was severely damaged in the collapse. The data is corrupted. We have no record of your radio transmissions or the sensor data from the 20 minutes prior to the failure." Sterling offered a thin, predatory smile. "It's your word against the superintendent's, Mr. Baker. And frankly, the timeline looks very bad for you. The company is preparing to hand this file over to the district attorney. They thought they had me. They thought they had buried the truth under corporate lawyers and convenient technical failures." I reached into the chest pocket of my flannel shirt and slowly pulled out the small black plastic diagnostic drive. I set it gently on the center of the wooden table. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The internal black box is probably dust by now, but BWE-7 had a secondary maintenance port." Sterling's smug expression faltered. Campbell suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. "What is that?" Investigator Harris asked, leaning forward, her eyes locked on the small drive. "Before I left the cab, I downloaded the last 4 hours of raw, unencrypted telematics directly from the primary bus," I explained, tapping the plastic casing with my index finger. "It has the micro-vibration telemetry from the track housing that doesn't trigger the dashboard alarms. It has the hydraulic pressure spikes. And most importantly, it has the complete time-stamped audio recording of my local and site-wide radio transmissions." Campbell physically recoiled in his chair. He stole company property!" "That data is proprietary. That data is evidence in a double homicide investigation," I said, my voice rising, the anger finally breaking through my enforced calm. I looked directly at Campbell. "It has the recording of me telling you the bearing was failing. It has the recording of me begging you to clear the ground crew. And it has the recording of you telling me, 'Operators don't stop for vibration.' You push through." I slid the drive across the table toward Investigator Harris. "I suggest you plug that into a secure terminal, ma'am." Because Carter Campbell didn't just ignore a mechanical failure. He ordered a man to bypass a federal safety lockout, put an unqualified operator in the seat, and killed 2 men for a quarterly bonus. Harris picked up the drive delicately, as if it were a live grenade. She looked at Sterling, who was suddenly very busy packing his briefcase, refusing to look at his client. "Mr. Campbell," Harris said, her tone devoid of any former neutrality, "I suggest you remain in the building. We will be reviewing this data immediately. If it contains what Mr. Baker says it does, this deposition will become a criminal inquiry." The air in the room shifted. The corporate shield shattered instantly. Sterling stood up, abandoning Campbell without a second thought. "The company will, of course, cooperate fully with any federal investigation, Mr. Ration. Campbell's actions, if proven true, were a gross violation of corporate policy and performed entirely rogue. They were already throwing him to the wolves." I stood up, pushing my chair back. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel the rushed triumph I thought I might. I just felt exhausted. "Am I free to go?" I asked Harris. "For now, Mr. Baker, please don't lead the state." As I walked toward the door, Campbell finally spoke. His voice was small, shaking, stripped of all the arrogance he had wielded on the radio. "Andrew, please, they'll put me away." I stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. I saw Henderson's face in my mind, and the twisted metal of the boom crushing the earth. "You did that yourself, Carter. The machine tried to warn you. I tried to warn you. You just wouldn't listen." 3 weeks later, the indictments came down. The downloaded audio was irrefutable. Carter Campbell was arrested for 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter and gross criminal negligence. The mining corporation was hit with the largest federal OSHA fine in state history, though everyone knew it was just a drop in the bucket for their bottom line. They fired the regional director, restructured the safety protocols, and publicly apologized. It all felt hollow. I visited Davis in the hospital the day after Campbell's arrest. His arm was pinned together with titanium, and he looked 10 years older. We sat in a sterile room, the silence between us heavy with the things we couldn't change. "They offered me a settlement," Davis said quietly, staring out the window. "Early retirement, medical covered, hush money, really." "Take it," I told him. "You earned it the hard way." "What about you, Andrew?" The union rep said the company offered to reinstate you, with back pay. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. I wouldn't set foot on one of their sites if they gave me the deed to the whole mountain. I had spent my life mastering those machines, learning their rhythms, respecting their power. But I had realized the hardest truth of the industry. The machines aren't the danger. The danger is the men in the clean shirts who sit miles away, deciding how much risk someone else's life is worth. "So what now?" Davis asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I'll find a small outfit, run a front loader, something where I can see the ground I'm working on." When I finally left the hospital, I drove out past the highway that bordered the mine. In the distance, BWE-7 was still there. It looked like a massive, rusted skeleton, cordoned off with miles of yellow tape. They were slowly dismantling it piece by piece, cutting away the twisted steel that had once been the pride of the fleet. I pulled over on the shoulder of the road and just watched it for a long time. I had saved myself by trusting my instincts, by trusting the machine over the management. But the guilt still sat heavy in my chest. I knew I couldn't have physically stopped Campbell. I knew I had followed the book, engaged the lockout, and warned everyone I could. But every time I closed my eyes, I still heard the scream of the tearing metal.